to today's explainer. We're diving right into one of the most incredible and honestly tragic paradoxes in modern history, the 1969 Soccer War. Just imagine the scene for a second. It's a standard 90-minute football game to qualify for the 1970 World Cup. We're talking about a sport that is literally celebrated for uniting people across cultures and continents. Yet in this one specific instance, that exact same game turned into an actual physical war. We're talking military tanks, fighter jets, and just absolute chaos. I am so excited to guide you through this because it is a mind-blowing example of how quickly history can escalate from a soccer pitch to a literal battlefield. So, can a football match actually start a war? It sounds totally absurd, doesn't it? Look, we hear sports broadcasters all the time using language that compares football to warfare. They talk about battles and attacks and front lines. We even treat our stadiums like they're fortresses. But that's normally just a metaphor, right? A way to add a little drama to the game. However, in the summer of 1969, during a super high-stakes series of World Cup qualifiers, that metaphor shattered completely. The lines between athletic competition and military aggression just vanished, and a sporting event became the terrifying reality of an armed conflict. And this brilliantly illustrates the completely surreal juxtaposition at the heart of our explainer today. On the one hand, you have the beautiful game. A standard 90 minutes of play, the sheer joy of scoring goals, and the absolute heights of human passion and athletic achievement. But then, on the flip side, we have the reality of the soccer war. That's 100 grueling hours of actual combat, active military airstrikes, and the deeply tragic reality of thousands of casualties. It's a staggering contrast, and it shows you exactly how extreme and rapidly destructive this whole situation became. To understand how all these chaotic events rapidly unfolded, we're going to follow a really clear, escalating narrative today. First, we'll hit the ultimate battleground. Second, boiling over borders. Third, 3 matches to war. Fourth, the 100-hour conflict, and finally, dangerous passions. Let's jump right in. Section 1, the ultimate battleground. Okay, so our story begins by setting the scene back in June of 1969. Down in Central America, the national teams of El Salvador and Honduras were gearing up to face off. Now, these were definitely not friendly exhibition games. These were intense, incredibly high-stakes qualifiers for the 1970 World Cup, which was going to be held right next door in Mexico. For both of these nations, qualifying meant an absolutely unprecedented level of international prestige and national pride. The pressure to advance on the global stage was just immense, completely transforming the football pitch into the ultimate battleground. Section 2, boiling over borders. Now, it is absolutely crucial for us to understand here that this war wasn't actually just about a game of football. To truly grasp what went down, we have to look way beyond the stadium and step back to examine the geopolitical context between El Salvador and Honduras at the time. The soccer matches? Well, they were really just the spark. The powder keg had been filling up for a really long time, driven by some very complex socioeconomic realities. Okay, let's dive into this. The pre-existing tensions between El Salvador and Honduras were deeply, deeply rooted in geography and demographics. First off, they had these ongoing, unresolved border disputes that stretched back over a century. Second, and probably most importantly, there were massive immigration and land issues. See, El Salvador was geographically much smaller but heavily populated, while Honduras was much larger and way less dense. Because of that dynamic, over 300,000 Salvadorans had crossed the border over the years, often illegally, to settle and farm on Honduran land. Well, by 1969, Honduras had enacted sweeping agrarian reform laws, which essentially seized land back from those Salvadoran immigrants and expelled them from the country. Thousands of displaced Salvadorans poured back across the border, creating this massive humanitarian and economic crisis in El Salvador. We're just neutrally laying out the facts here to show that the football matches simply ignited a fire that was already heavily fueled by these deep-seated, pre-existing disputes. Section 3, 3 matches to war. So, with that geopolitical powder keg fully set, the teams took the field. And from here on out, the situation just deteriorates with alarming speed. We're going to look at the 3 specific matches that pushed these nations right over the edge. It was honestly like acting as a sports commentator, watching a play tragically break down into complete chaos, whistle by whistle. Let's move to and see how this builds across these 3 matches. Game 1 took place on June 8th down in Honduras. The home team won 1-0, but the atmosphere around the game was completely toxic. Honduran fans engaged in extreme psychological warfare. They literally surrounded the Salvadoran team's hotel all night, honking car horns, beating drums, and throwing stones at the windows just to stop the players from sleeping. The immediate aftermath? Massive riots. Then, for Game 2 on June 15th, the venue shifted over to El Salvador, and retaliation was swift and brutal. Salvadoran fans did the exact same thing to the Honduran players, but significantly escalated the violence. El Salvador ended up winning 3-0 on their home turf, but instead of a celebration, the stadium literally turned into a war zone. Angry crowds were clashing, and the Honduran team actually had to flee the area in bulletproof vehicles. Because they split the first two games, the whole shebang came down to a third and final decider match. Because tensions were running so dangerously high at this point, this final decider match had to be played on neutral ground in Mexico City on June 26th. The tension in that stadium was just suffocating. A massive police presence was required, literally just to keep the fans apart. Ultimately, El Salvador won the game 3-2 in extra time. And that exact moment, that final whistle blowing on neutral ground, was the ultimate breaking point. On the very same day of that match, El Salvador officially severed all diplomatic ties with Honduras. The sporting event was over, but a geopolitical disaster had just been unleashed. Section 4. The 100-hour conflict. Now, I really want us to slow down our pace for a moment here and ground ourselves in the sobering reality of what happened next. The adrenaline of the football matches was over, and the incredibly dark reality of military conflict quickly took its place. Let's just trace this timeline for a second because it's truly staggering. In early June 1969, the World Cup qualifiers began. After 90-plus minutes of extra time in that late June decider match, the final straw snapped, leading to severed diplomatic ties. And then, the unbelievable reality. On July 14, 1969, just over 2 weeks after that final game, El Salvador's military officially launched coordinated airstrikes on Honduran targets, which was quickly followed by a major ground invasion. Just like that, the two nations were plunged into a devastating war, bringing the chaos from the football stands directly to the front lines. So the crucial point is that this war lasted for exactly 100 hours before a ceasefire was finally negotiated by the Organization of American States on July 20th. Historically, it became known as the 100-Hour War. Now, while 100 hours might sound pretty brief in the grand timeline of global conflicts, let's just pause to acknowledge the absolute devastation packed into those 4 days. Over 3,000 people were killed, and the vast majority of them were Honduran civilians. Furthermore, over 100,000 people were completely displaced, forced to flee their homes and their livelihoods. Trade between the two nations completely collapsed, which devastated the Central American common market for decades. The impact was massive, sudden, and deeply, deeply tragic. Section 5. Dangerous Passions. As we step completely away from the immediate adrenaline of that historical timeline, we're really left to reflect on the real-world meaning of this whole event. We all universally celebrate the passion that sports ignite in us, right? But this explainer actually forces us to look squarely at the dark side of that exact same passion. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is this quote right here, because it perfectly summarizes the completely bizarre and tragic reality of this historical paradox. It reads, "The war lasted for 100 hours, all triggered by a 90-minute football game. It is such a vital reminder of how a beautiful game, when you mix it with dangerous pre-existing political friction, massive demographic pressures, and intense social tensions, can go dangerously, horribly wrong. The sport itself wasn't the root cause, but the intense nationalism it provoked, that was the ultimate catalyst for the devastation." Which brings us to our final thought for today. Did you know a sport could start a war? It is literally a piece of mind-blowing history that forces us to view the games we love through a slightly different, maybe more cautious lens. I'd love to hear what you think about this, so please drop a comment with your thoughts below, and be sure to subscribe to join us for more fascinating historical explainers. Thanks.